There exists within the human psyche a peculiar form of bondage, one that binds us not with chains of iron, but with threads of our own weaving. We become prisoners of our perpetual need to explain ourselves, to justify our existence, to make ourselves palatable to a world that may never truly taste our essence. This is the glass cage Jung spoke of when he described the persona's tyranny over the soul. Transparent walls that seem to offer protection while slowly suffocating the authentic self within. Watch the child who discovers, perhaps for the first time, that their natural expression meets with disapproval. See how quickly they learn to contort their truth into shapes more pleasing to the adult eye. This is the birth of the great wound, the moment we begin to believe that our raw, unfiltered being is somehow insufficient, somehow dangerous, somehow wrong. From this wound springs the compulsive need to explain, to rationalize, to make our very existence acceptable to others. The ego, that frightened sentinel of consciousness, takes up this burden with the dedication of a zealot. Like a child lost in a dark forest, it reaches out desperately to every passing shadow, hoping for recognition, for understanding, for the simple affirmation that we have a right to exist as we are. But shadows cannot embrace us, and the more we grasp at them, the more elusive they become. This reaching outward becomes our habitual stance toward life. We develop an exhausting repertoire of explanations for our choices, our feelings, our very being. We learn to preface our truth with apologies, to cushion our authenticity with qualifications, to serve our deepest insights wrapped in the acceptable language of social convention. The soul learns to speak in foreign tongues, translating its native wisdom into the crude dialects of mass approval. Consider how this manifests in the ordinary moments of daily existence. We explain why we chose this path instead of that one, why we feel joy when others expect sorrow, why we remain silent when others demand speech. We become archaeologists of our own motivations, constantly excavating reasons that might satisfy the invisible tribunal of social judgment. The spontaneous gesture withers under the weight of anticipated questioning. The authentic response dies before it can draw breath. The glass cage grows more elaborate with each passing year. We construct detailed justifications for our preferences, our boundaries, our dreams. We develop sophisticated theories about why we are the way we are, as if our very existence were a thesis requiring defense before a panel of critics who themselves have never learned to live without explanation. The cage becomes so familiar that we mistake it for home, so transparent that we forget it surrounds us. What we fail to recognize in this perpetual performance is that the audience we so desperately seek to convince is largely an projection of our own wounded relationship with authentic being. The voices demanding explanation are often echoes of our own self-doubt, reverberating through the chambers of a psyche that has forgotten its inherent worth. We become the prosecutor, the defendant, and the judge in a trial that need never have been convened. The sacred wound of needing others to understand us runs deeper than mere insecurity. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of truth itself. We act as if truth were a commodity that gains value only through external validation, as if our inner knowing was somehow inferior to others' opinions about our experience. The soul, which speaks in the wordless language of direct knowing, finds itself forced to translate its wisdom into the impoverished vocabulary of social acceptability. This is the exhausting dance. Jung observed the endless choreography of justification that keeps the soul small and manageable. We learn to move in carefully prescribed steps, to leap only when others applaud, to express only what can be easily digested by the collective palate. The wild, untamed dance of authentic being, that raw expression of the self in all its contradictory glory, becomes a distant memory. A childhood dream we tell ourselves was never real. The masks accumulate like sedimentary layers, each one representing a different audience we've tried to please, a different version of ourselves we've presented for approval. The businessman mask, worn smooth by years of conforming to corporate expectations. The good daughter mask, polished bright by the need to maintain family harmony. The spiritual seeker mask, carefully crafted to meet the expectations of those who would judge our enlightenment. Each mask serves its purpose, but together they form a sarcophagus that entombs the living soul. Beneath these layers of acceptable presentation lies the authentic self, not the perfect self, not the idealized self, but the real self in all its messy, contradictory, gloriously human complexity. This self needs no explanation because it simply is. It exists prior to justification, beyond the reach of social approval or disapproval. It is the irreducible core of being that remains when all the masks have fallen away. Yet we fear this self as much as we long for it. We intuit its power, its refusal to be diminished by others' incomprehension. We sense that to live from this place would require a kind of courage we're not sure we possess. The courage to exist without permission, to be without apology, to speak truth without first calculating its reception. This is why we cling to our glass cage even as it suffocates us. Better the familiar prison of explanation than the terrifying freedom of authentic being. The moment of recognition arrives differently for each soul, but it arrives nonetheless. We find ourselves exhausted by the endless performance, worn thin by the constant translation of our truth into acceptable forms. Perhaps in a moment of crisis, or in the stillness that follows great loss, we catch a glimpse of the energy we've been hemorrhaging in this futile attempt to make ourselves understood. We see, perhaps for the first time, the vast distance between who we really are and who we've been pretending to be. This recognition is both gift and wound, blessing and burden. For to see the cage is to know that we ourselves have built it, key by key, explanation by explanation. The door was never locked from the outside. The prison was always of our own making. And in this terrible recognition lies the seed of our liberation, the understanding that what we have built, we can also dismantle. There is a theater within you, and you are both its star and its most captive audience. Every morning, as consciousness draws its first breath, you reach for the costume that has become more familiar than your own skin. The persona, that exquisite mask carved from society's expectations. And your own desperate need to belong slides over your features like a second face, more practiced in its expressions than the one you were born with. Watch yourself in this moment of transformation. See how your shoulders straighten to carry the weight of others' projections. How your voice modulates to frequencies that will not disturb the collective slumber. This is not mere acting. This is the sacred ritual of disappearance, where the authentic self retreats so far into the wings that even you forget it was ever center stage. The persona whispers its seductive promises, where me and you will be safe, where me and you will be loved, where me and the terrible vulnerability of your true nature will remain hidden in the shadows where it belongs. And so you do. You slip into this second skin with the practiced ease of a magician performing the same trick for the 1000th time, the trick of making yourself vanish while remaining perfectly visible. But masks, no matter how beautifully crafted, were never meant to be worn indefinitely. They are meant for ceremonies, for sacred theater, for the brief moments when we must dance with forces larger than ourselves. Yet you have made yours a permanent fixture, forgetting that beneath its polished surface, your authentic face continues to breathe, continues to feel, continues to yearn for the light of genuine recognition. The audience for whom you performed this elaborate charade, who are they really? Look closely at the faces in your imagined theater. Some are ghosts from childhood, their approval forever frozen in time, their judgment echoing across decades. Others are strangers whose opinions you've elevated to the status of divine decree, their fleeting glances becoming the mirrors in which you seek validation. Still others are projections of your own inner critic, dressed in the clothing of society, but speaking with the voice of your deepest fears. You perform for parents who may never have asked for such elaborate performances, for lovers who fell in love with your mask and now wonder where you went, for colleagues who are performing their own desperate shows and have no time to truly see yours. You perform for a culture that demands conformity while secretly craving authenticity, for institutions that reward sameness while preaching individuality. And in this grand theater of social acceptance, something profound begins to die. Not all at once, that would be too merciful to clean. Instead, it withers slowly, like a flower trying to bloom in a room with no windows. Your authentic impulses, those spontaneous movements of the soul that once brought you such alive joy, begin to feel foreign, dangerous, inappropriate. The laugh that bubbles up from your belly gets edited into something more palatable. The tears that want to flow get redirected into acceptable channels. The rage that signals boundary violations gets transformed into pleasant compliance. This is the great tragedy of the persona, not that it exists, for it serves necessary functions in the complex dance of human society, but that it becomes a prison. Is the face, that the performance is the person, that the careful construction of our social identity is the sum total of who we are. Listen to the language you use when speaking of yourself. How often do you say, "I should," when you mean "they"? Expect. How frequently do you describe your desires in terms of what others would approve of? Notice how you've learned to translate your authentic impulses into socially acceptable formulations, like a scholar rendering poetry into prose, losing all the music in service of clarity. The persona develops its own intelligence, its own survival instincts. It learns to read rooms with microscopic precision, adjusting its performance in real time to maximize approval and minimize conflict. It becomes so sophisticated that it can predict what version of you will be most welcome in any given situation, then summon that character with seamless efficiency. But here is what the persona cannot do. It cannot love or be loved. It can only exchange performances, trade masks, negotiate the terms of mutual pretense. It cannot create authentic intimacy because intimacy requires the very vulnerability the persona was designed to hide. It cannot access genuine creativity because creativity emerges from the unguarded places the persona has learned to protect. It cannot experience true joy because joy is always a response to authentic contact with life, and the persona exists in eternal separation from direct experience in the depths of night. When the theater empties and the lights dim, you may catch glimpses of the one who waits behind the mask. This authentic self, what Jung called the greater personality, whispers its truth in dreams, in sudden moments of unguarded laughter, in the tears that come without explanation. It speaks through your body's rebellion against roles that no longer fit, through the exhaustion that follows days of elaborate performance, through the strange hollow feeling that accompanies external success achieved at the cost of internal betrayal. The tragedy deepens when you realize that many of those for whom you perform are themselves wearing masks, creating an endless hall of mirrors where personas interact with personas while authentic souls remain hidden. Longing for contact. You perform for an audience that may not even exist in the way you imagine it, seeking approval from people who are too busy seeking their own approval to offer you the recognition you crave. Consider the exquisite irony. The more perfectly you perform your persona, the more isolated you become. The very mask designed to connect you with others creates an impermeable barrier between your true self and the world. You become lonely in crowded rooms, successful yet unfulfilled, admired for qualities that feel foreign to your authentic nature. This is not failure. This is the necessary stage in the soul's journey toward wholeness. The persona must be lived fully before it can be transcended. You must exhaust yourself with performance before you discover the possibility of presence. You must experience the complete loneliness of the mask before you can appreciate the communion available to your unguarded face. The first crack in the persona often comes through what Jung called enantiodromia, the sudden reversal, where something that has been carried to its extreme flips into its opposite. The perfect student rebels. The dutiful child breaks every rule. The people pleaser finally says no. These reversals are not breakdowns, but breakouts. The soul's desperate attempt to break free from the costume that has become a straitjacket. Watch for these moments in your own life, the times when you surprise yourself by acting completely out of character, when something authentic bursts through the careful construction of your social identity. These are not lapses in judgment, but lapses in the persona's control. Moments when your true nature asserts itself despite all your conditioning to the contrary. The work of individuation begins with recognizing the persona for what it is. A useful tool that has become a tyrant, a necessary adaptation that has outlived its usefulness. A character you created to survive, who now prevents you from truly living. This recognition brings both relief and terror relief at finally naming what has felt so false. Terror at imagining life without the mask that has defined your identity for so long. But you cannot skip this recognition. You cannot move toward authentic selfhood while still believing that the persona is your true face. The journey toward wholeness requires the courage to look behind the mask, to acknowledge the one who has been waiting in the wings of your own life, forgotten but never truly lost. The desperate performance of the persona is coming to an end, not through force, but through exhaustion, not through judgment, but through recognition. You are beginning to remember that beneath every mask lives a face that has never stopped being beautiful, never stopped being worthy of love, never stopped being authentically, irreplaceably you. There exists within each of us a vault of silence, sealed with the heavy locks of propriety, fear, and the desperate need to be loved. Within this vault live the words we have never spoken, the truths we have never dared to breathe into the light of day. These are not mere thoughts or passing feelings. They are the molten core of our authentic being, so potent and raw that we fear their very existence might incinerate the carefully constructed bridges we have built to others. This is the shadow of unexpressed truth, and it moves behind us like a second self, darker and more knowing than the persona we present to the world. It carries within its folds all the things we believe ourselves to be, but dare not claim, all the desires we hunger for, but refuse to name, all the rage and ecstasy and desperate longing that we have deemed too dangerous for daylight. Jung understood this shadow not as evil, but as unlived life, the repository of everything we have pushed away in service of belonging, of being acceptable, of maintaining the fragile peace we mistake for happiness. Yet what we refuse to acknowledge does not simply disappear. It gathers strength in the darkness, feeding on our fear, growing more powerful with each swallowed word, each bitten tongue. Each moment we choose the safe lie over the dangerous truth. Consider the serpent coiled at the base of your spine, that ancient symbol of wisdom and transformation. In many traditions, this serpent represents the kundalini, the dormant energy that, when awakened, brings both destruction and enlightenment. The shadow of unexpressed truth is precisely this serpent energy. It lies in wait, patient as stone, until the moment when silence becomes more unbearable than speech, when the cost of hiding becomes greater than the risk of revelation. We fear this shadow because we have been taught that truth is a luxury we cannot afford. From childhood, we learn to read the faces around us, to modulate our voices, to shape our very thoughts into forms that will not disturb the peace. We become masterful editors of our own experience, cutting away the inconvenient passages, the uncomfortable chapters, the scenes that might make others squirm or turn away. But what happens to the deleted scenes of our lives? They do not vanish. They form their own underground narrative, a shadow story that runs parallel to our public life. In this shadow story, we are wilder, more honest, more alive. In this shadow story, we speak the truths that make our hearts pound and our hands shake. In this shadow story, we are not the carefully curated version of ourselves, but something far more dangerous and infinitely more real. The persona we present to the world is like a beautiful mask, crafted with such skill that we sometimes forget there is a face beneath it. This mask speaks in measured tones, chooses its words carefully, never ventures too far into the territories of raw feeling or unpolished thought. It is the diplomat of the psyche, always smoothing over the rough edges, always finding the socially acceptable way to express even the most radical internal experiences. Yet beneath this mask, the shadow of unexpressed truth grows restless. It knows things the persona refuses to acknowledge. It remembers the dreams the persona has forgotten, the longings the persona has explained away, the authentic responses the persona has learned to suppress. This shadow holds within it not only our rejected aspects, but our unrealized potential, the ways we might have been, could still become, if only we had the courage to speak our truth. The tragedy is that in our effort to be lovable, we often become unknowable. In our quest to avoid rejection, we offer only the sanitized versions of ourselves, wondering why our connections feel hollow. Why, even in the midst of company, we carry a bone-deep loneliness. We present our credentials instead of our questions, our accomplishments instead of our struggles, our carefully crafted opinions instead of our raw, unformed wonderings. But the shadow knows better. The shadow remembers the moments when we almost spoke, when the truth was right there on our tongue, hot and ready, before we swallowed it back down. The shadow carries the weight of all these almost moments, these near births of authenticity that we aborted at the last second out of fear. This fear is not irrational. To speak our unexpressed truth is to risk everything we think we have built. It is to potentially shatter the image others have of us, to disappoint those who have invested in our persona, to reveal that beneath our careful composure lies something wild and unpredictable. It is to acknowledge that we are not who we have pretended to be, not even to ourselves. Yet Jung teaches us that what we resist persists, and what we refuse to integrate eventually overwhelms us. The shadow of unexpressed truth does not remain forever silent. it finds other ways to speak through our symptoms, our slip-ups, our inexplicable reactions to seemingly innocent situations. It speaks through the dreams that wake us gasping, the sudden tears that ambush us in grocery stores, the inexplicable rage that rises when someone touches too close to the truths we have buried. The integration of this shadow is not about suddenly becoming indiscriminately honest, spilling every unfiltered thought into the world. It is about recognizing that our unexpressed truths hold energy, creative, transformative energy that we desperately need for our own individuation. When we constantly suppress what wants to be spoken, we deplete ourselves, becoming pale copies of what we could be. The work begins with acknowledgement, not necessarily to others, but to ourselves. To sit quietly and ask, what am I not saying? What truths am I carrying that feel too dangerous to speak? What aspects of my experience am I editing out before they even reach my conscious awareness? This inquiry requires tremendous courage, for it means encountering parts of ourselves that we have deemed unacceptable. We might discover anger we thought was unspiritual, desires we thought were inappropriate, opinions we thought were too controversial, needs we thought were too demanding. We might find that beneath our carefully cultivated niceness lies a fierce creature with sharp teeth and strong opinions. But here is the paradox that Jung understood so well. It is precisely these rejected aspects that hold the keys to our wholeness. The very qualities we have pushed into shadow often contain our greatest gifts, our deepest wisdom, our most necessary contributions to the world. The anger we have suppressed might be righteous indignation at injustice. The desire we have denied might be the compass pointing toward our true purpose. The controversial opinion might be the perspective the world desperately needs to hear. The shadow of unexpressed truth is not our enemy, is our unrealized ally. It holds not only what we fear about ourselves, but what we have failed to treasure. It contains not only our perceived flaws, but our unclaimed power. To befriend this shadow is to reclaim the energy we have spent in constant self-censorship, the vitality we have drained through perpetual performance. This reclamation is not a single event, but a gradual process of increasing honesty, first with ourselves, then, carefully and wisely, with others. It means learning to distinguish between the truth that serves and the truth that merely wounds, between authentic expression and reactive dumping, between honesty and cruelty. As we begin to give voice to our unexpressed truths, we discover something remarkable. The very people we feared would reject our authenticity are often the ones who have been waiting for permission to drop their own masks. Our courage to be real becomes an invitation for others to step out of their own shadow of unexpressed truth. The vulnerable honesty we thought would isolate us becomes the bridge to deeper connection. The serpent of suppressed truth, when finally allowed to rise, does not destroy, it transforms. It burns away the false structures that have confined us, but in that burning, it illuminates the golden threads of our authentic being. What emerges from this fire is not the polished persona we have been perfecting, but something far more valuable, a human being integrated enough to speak their truth with both power and compassion, wild enough to be real, wise enough to know when silence serves and when words heal. In the end, the shadow of unexpressed truths teaches us that our attempts to be universally acceptable have made us specifically irrelevant. Our carefully guarded secrets often turn out to be the very medicine the world has been waiting for us to share. The voice we have been so afraid to use carries within it not only our liberation, but perhaps the liberation of others who have been waiting to hear that they, too, can stop hiding and start living. This is the great reversal, the enantiodromia. Jung spoke of the moment when what we thought was our greatest weakness reveals itself as our deepest strength, when the shadow we feared becomes the light we needed, when the truth we dared not speak becomes the song the world has been waiting to hear. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the desperate hunger for external validation transforms into something far more profounder, deep, abiding silence that is not empty but pregnant with possibility. This is not the silence of defeat, nor the muteness of suppression, but the sacred quiet of the alchemical laboratory, where the raw ore of experience is transmuted into the gold of wisdom through the mysterious fire of inner knowing. For too long, we have mistaken silence for absence, equating the cessation of our compulsive explanations with a kind of spiritual death. Yet Jung understood that in the deepest recesses of the psyche, silence is the womb of transformation, a space so full of potential that it hums with the frequency of creation itself. When we finally cease our exhausting attempts to make others understand the labyrinthine complexity of our inner world, we discover that we have been carrying within us all along the very thing we sought to find in their recognition, the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear in the world, thrives on validation and comprehension. It feeds on the nods of approval, the knowing glances, the reassuring words that confirm our rightness, our worthiness, our place in the grand scheme of human understanding. But beneath this surface dweller lives the true self, that eternal, unchanging essence that requires no external confirmation because it exists in perfect communion with the source of its own being. To enter into this silence is to descend into the sacred laboratory of the soul, where the ancient art of psychological alchemy unfolds in ways that defy rational explanation. Here, in this inner sanctum, the lead of our unprocessed pain, our unexpressed truths, our misunderstood depths, begins its slow transformation into something infinitely more precious. This is not a process that can be rushed or forced, for it follows the organic timing of the unconscious, moving according to rhythms as old as the earth itself. The great work of individuation requires us to become comfortable with being profoundly misunderstood by the world, while simultaneously being completely known by ourselves. This paradox, being invisible to others while becoming transparent to our own consciousness, represents one of the most challenging passages in the soul's evolution. We must learn to find nourishment not in the applause of the crowd, but in the quiet affirmation of our own authentic being. In this sacred silence, we begin to understand that our deepest truths were never meant to be fully grasped by others. They are like rare flowers that bloom only in the secret gardens of the inner world, their beauty visible only to the one who has cultivated the soil of self-knowledge with patience and devotion. The compulsive need to be understood reveals itself as another form of spiritual materialism, grasping after external confirmation that keeps us exiled from the very treasure we seek. The shadow, too, finds its place in this alchemical process. All those aspects of ourselves that we have hidden, denied, or projected onto others must be reclaimed in the crucible of silent self-acceptance. In the darkness of our own unexpressed nature, we discover not the monsters we feared, but the disowned parts of our wholeness, waiting to be integrated with the compassion that only true self-knowledge can provide. This integration cannot happen in the bright lights of public scrutiny or in the anxious performance of seeking approval. It requires the protective darkness of solitude, the fertile void of not knowing, the spacious silence where our fractured pieces can slowly reassemble themselves according to their original design. Here, In this inner laboratory, we become both the alchemist and the substance being transformed, both the witness and the witnessed, both the seeker and the sought. The ego, accustomed to its role as primary narrator and chief negotiator with the external world, may initially resist this descent into silent knowing. It may interpret the cessation of explanation as a kind of defeat, a giving up on the possibility of ever being truly seen. But as we settle more deeply into this sacred silence, we begin to understand that what feels like surrender is actually the most profound victory, the triumph of authenticity over performance, of being over seeming, of inner knowing over outer validation. In the depths of this silence, we encounter what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to synthesize opposites into a new understanding that encompasses both, without being limited by either. The need to be understood and the acceptance of being misunderstood merge into something greater. The recognition that our true nature transcends both comprehension and incomprehension, existing in a realm beyond the reach of ordinary perception. This is where the real alchemy begins, not in the desperate attempt to transform lead into gold through external recognition, but in the patient tending of the inner fire that reveals the gold that was always present, waiting to be discovered beneath the accumulated sediment of seeking approval. The silence becomes our teacher, showing us that fullness is not found in having our depths plumbed by others, but in dwelling within those depths ourselves with complete acceptance and wonder. As we learn to inhabit this pregnant void, we discover that our capacity for genuine connection with others actually deepens. No longer driven by the compulsive need to be understood, we become free to truly see and hear those around us. Our relationships transform from desperate transactions of mutual validation into sacred encounters between two mysteries, each complete in themselves, yet enriched by the presence of the other. The alchemy of silent knowing teaches us that wisdom is not information to be shared, but transformation to be embodied. It is not something we possess, but something we become. In the quiet laboratory of the soul, away from the noise of explanation and justification, we discover that our truest understanding emerges not from being comprehended by others, but from comprehending ourselves so completely that external validation becomes as unnecessary as carrying water to the ocean. This silent knowing does not make us withdrawn or disconnected from the world. Rather, it makes us more present, more authentic, more capable of genuine intimacy, because we no longer come to our encounters with others as beggars, seeking confirmation, but as whole beings, offering the gift of our authentic presence. We speak when speaking serves love, and remain silent when silence serves truth. Guided not by the ego's desperate hunger for understanding, but by the self's deep wisdom about when to reveal and when to conceal. In this sacred laboratory of the psyche, we learn that the greatest transformations happen not in the bright light of public recognition, but in the mysterious darkness of inner gestation, like the caterpillar dissolving in the chrysalis. We must be willing to become temporarily incomprehensible even to ourselves in order to emerge as something entirely new. The silence protects this process, creating a sacred container within which the impossible becomes inevitable, and the lead of our unlived lives transforms into the gold of our realized potential. The pregnant void of silent knowing becomes our most trusted companion, teaching us that emptiness is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything in its potential form. In this fullness that appears empty, this silence that speaks louder than words, this knowing that transcends understanding, we find the pearl of great price that we had been seeking in all the wrong places, the recognition that we are, and have always been, exactly what we were looking for. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the old self must die, not the dramatic death of flesh and bone, but the far more profound dissolution of the false identity we have carried, like a corpse on our backs. This is the death that Jung called necessary, the symbolic dying that precedes all authentic rebirth. It is the moment when the approval-seeking self, that weary traveler who has wandered so far from home in search of others' acceptance, finally lays down its burden and surrenders to the inevitable. The alchemists knew this darkness well. They called it negredo, the blackening, the putrefaction that must occur before any genuine transformation can begin. In their secret laboratories, they watched as base metals dissolved into formless matter, understanding that this apparent destruction was not an ending, but a beginning. The old form had to die completely before the new could emerge. So it is with the human psyche. The self that has lived for others' approval must undergo its own negredo, its own necessary dissolution. This death arrives not as a single catastrophic event, but as a gradual recognition that seeps through the soul like water through stone. Perhaps it begins with the growing awareness that no amount of explanation will ever be enough, that the hunger for approval is a bottomless well that no external validation can fill. Or perhaps it starts with the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that comes from maintaining a self that was never real, from performing a life that was never truly lived. The approval-seeking self has been many things to many people. It has been the good child who swallowed their truth to maintain family peace. It has been the accommodating friend who said yes when every fiber of their being screamed no. It has been the perfect employee who smiled while their soul withered in fluorescent-lit cubicles. It has been the spiritual seeker who performed enlightenment for others' admiration. This self has worn 1,000 masks, spoken 1,000 languages, contorted itself into countless shapes, all in service of the great illusion that acceptance from others could somehow make up for the lack of acceptance from within. But illusions, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually crumble under the weight of their own falseness. The moment comes when we can no longer remember who we were before we began this elaborate performance. We look in the mirror and see a stranger, someone we created to be lovable, acceptable, safe. The recognition is both terrible and liberating. We see that we have been living a lie so complete, so all-encompassing, that we mistook it for truth. This is when the real dying begins. Not the clean, quick death of the body, but the slow dissolution of everything we thought we were. The carefully constructed personality begins to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to air. The stories we told ourselves about why we needed others' approval start to sound hollow, echoing in the empty chambers of a heart that has forgotten how to beat for itself alone. The people-pleasing ego, that exhausted servant who has carried others' expectations like stones in its pockets, finally stumbles and falls. It has been running for so long, running toward approval, running from rejection, running in circles around the authentic self it was meant to protect, that it no longer remembers why it began running in the first place. The muscles of accommodation grow tired. The smile becomes too heavy to hold. The yes becomes impossible to speak when every cell in the body is screaming no. This dying is not dramatic. There are no witnesses, no ceremonies, no final words. It happens in the quiet moments when we realize we cannot continue as we have been. It happens when we sit alone in our rooms and feel the weight of all the personas we've carried, all the selves we've created to be acceptable to others. It happens when we understand, with a clarity that cuts through decades of self-deception, that we have sacrificed our truth on the altar of others' comfort. The funeral of the full self is a private, a fab. We gather around the deathbed of our approval-seeking identity and watch as it releases its hold on life. All the masks it wore, all the performances it gave, all the elaborate explanations it offered, they fall away like autumn leaves, returning to the earth from which they came. We see them now for what they always were, decorations on a coffin, beautiful perhaps, but housing something that was never truly alive. In this darkness of dissolution, panic often arises. Who are we without our carefully crafted acceptability? What remains when the people-pleasing self is no longer there to mediate between our truth and the world's expectations? The ego, faced with its own mortality, fights back with every weapon. In its arsenal, it promises to be better, to try harder, to find new ways to earn the approval it has always craved. It offers bargains and compromises, anything to avoid the complete dissolution that is required. But there is no negotiating with the Negredo. This darkness has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own inexorable process. It strips away everything that is not essential, everything that was built for others' eyes, rather than emerging from the soul's authentic ground. The process is thorough and merciless, leaving no corner of the psyche unexplored, no false identity untouched. We mourn during this time not just for the self that is dying, but for all the years we spent believing that others' opinions mattered more than our own truth. We grieve for the authentic expressions we never allowed ourselves, the dreams we abandoned to maintain others' comfort, the words we never spoke because they might disturb the careful peace we had constructed around others' expectations. The mourning is deep and necessary, for what dies during the Negredo was never truly alive, but it consumed the energy that should have been feeding our real life. The decomposition reveals layer after layer of false identity. Each mask that falls away exposes another beneath it, and another beneath that, until we wonder if there is anything solid at the core. This is the terror and the gift of the Negredo. It shows us how much of what we took to be ourselves was actually borrowed, adopted, stolen from others' ideas of who we should be. The approval-seeking self, we discover, was not a unified entity, but a committee of voices, each one representing a different audience we tried to please. There is the voice that speaks in our mother's disappointed tones, reminding us of all the ways we have failed to meet her expectations. There is the voice that echoes our first teacher's corrections, still trying to make us acceptable to the classroom's judgmental eyes. There is the voice of every lover who found us lacking, every friend who withdrew their affection when we dared to be real, every authority figure who taught us that love was conditional on performance. These voices have been the board of directors for the approval-seeking self, and during the Negredo, we watched them lose that power one by one. The death of the approval-seeking self is also the death of the illusion that we can control how others see us. This fantasy that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, perform convincingly enough, sacrifice completely enough, others will finally understand and accept us dissolves in the acid of honest recognition. We see that others' opinions of us say more about them than about us, that their acceptance or rejection is filtered through their own wounds, their own projections, their own unfinished business with authenticity. As the false self dies, something else begins to stir in the darkness. It is not yet clear, not yet formed, but it carries the unmistakable pulse of authentic life. This is not the manufacture, vitality of the people-pleasing self, which drew its energy from others' responses, but something that exists independent of external validation. It is the first stirring of what Jung called the self-nut, the ego self that seeks approval, but the deeper self that needs no permission to exist. The dying process teaches us about the difference between these two selves. The approval-seeking self was always fragile because it depended on others for its very existence. It could be devastated by a critical look, destroyed by withdrawal of affection, sent into crisis by the simple act of being misunderstood. But this new stirring in the darkness is different. It exists prior to others' opinions, beneath their judgments, beyond their capacity to validate or invalidate. During the Nigredo, we learn to distinguish between the voice of the dying ego and the whisper of the emerging self. The ego speaks in familiar tones of panic and bargaining, trying to resurrect the old ways of being acceptable. But the self speaks in silence, in breath, in the simple fact of being that requires no justification. Learning to hear this deeper voice while the ego's death throes create such noise around us, this is one of the great tasks of the Nigredo. The alchemists understood that the Nigredo could not be rushed or avoided. They knew that trying to skip this stage of dissolution would only result in false transformation, the creation of fool's gold instead of the genuine article. So too with the death of the approval-seeking self. We cannot think our way through it, cannot negotiate our way around it, cannot perform our way past it. We can only surrender to its dark intelligence and trust that what dies was never truly alive, while what is truly alive can never die. As the death reaches its completion, a strange peace settles over the soul. The frantic energy of trying to be acceptable to others finally stills. The exhausting dance of justification comes to its natural end. In this stillness, we can finally hear what has been trying to speak through us all along, not the manufactured voice of the people-pleasing self, but the authentic voice of who we have always been beneath the masks. This voice speaks not in explanations, but in simple presence, not in justifications, but in the pure fact of being. The funeral of the approval-seeking self marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. What rises from these ashes will be something entirely new, not a reformed version of the old self, but a genuinely authentic being who has learned the most dangerous truth of all, that we never needed others' approval to exist fully in the first place. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when something unprecedented emerges from the wreckage of who you thought you were supposed to be. It rises not with fanfare, but with the quiet authority of a mountain appearing through morning mist, undeniable, unchangeable, and somehow threatening to the carefully constructed world around you. This is the birth of your dangerous self, dangerous, not because it seeks to harm, but because it has ceased to seek permission to exist. Watch how the world responds to your newfound wholeness. See how your simple presence, no longer performing, no longer apologizing for your authentic nature, creates ripples of unease in those still trapped within their own elaborate masks. You have become a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous things. In a world built on collective pretense, the danger you now represent is not the danger of violence or cruelty. It is something far more subversive, the danger of truth lived without apology, of authenticity expressed without seeking approval, of a human being who has remembered their inherent worth and no longer requires external validation to confirm their right to exist. In a society addicted to performance, such presence becomes an act of quiet revolution. Your integrated self moves through the world with a different quality of attention. Where once you scanned every room for signs of approval or disapproval, now you simply arrive, fully present, fully yourself, fully available to whatever truth the moment might contain. The shift in your being registers in others' unconscious. Like a seismic tremor, something in their carefully balanced world has changed, and they cannot name what disturbs them. The people still performing their elaborate personas sense in you something they have forgotten in themselves. Your presence reminds them of the authentic self they abandoned in childhood, the one they buried beneath layers of should and must and what will people think. In your eyes, they catch glimpses of the person they might have been if they had not chosen safety over truth, approval over authenticity, belonging over becoming. This is why your wholeness appears threatening, not because you judge their choices, but because your very existence suggests that other choices were possible. Your comfort with your own imperfections highlights their exhausting pursuit of impossible perfection. Your willingness to speak truth reflects their habit of careful editing. Your spontaneous laughter echoes against their calculated responses. You have become what Jung called a catalyst for others' unconscious material. Simply by being yourself, fully, unapologetically, authentically, activate in others the very aspects of themselves they have worked so hard to suppress. The shadow material they have projected onto others begins to withdraw, forcing them to confront what they have denied in themselves. Watch how some people become uncomfortable in your presence without being able to articulate why. They may describe you as too intense or too much or somehow different, but what they are really responding to is the absence of the familiar dance of mutual performance. You are no longer participating in the collective agreement to pretend. And this non-participation feels like betrayal to those still bound by invisible contracts of conformity. Your dangerous self speaks truths that others whisper only in their most private moments. You acknowledge feelings the polite society has deemed inappropriate. You express needs that the collective has labeled selfish. You honor desires that the group has condemned as unacceptable. In doing so, you become a living reminder of everything others have sacrificed on the altar of social acceptance. The integrated self possesses a quality that the persona can never achieve: genuine power. Not the power that comes from controlling others or manipulating circumstances, but the power that emerges from complete self-acceptance. You no longer need others to be different than they are in order for you to be okay. You no longer require external validation to confirm your worth. You no longer seek permission from the world to exist as you are. This authentic power is perhaps the most threatening aspect of your transformation. In a world where most people have given their power away to authorities, to institutions, to the opinion of others, your self-possession appears almost supernatural. You have what they have been seeking outside themselves all along: the unshakable knowing that you are enough, exactly as you are. Your presence becomes a question mark in others' carefully constructed sentences about how life should be lived. Without saying a word, you challenge their assumptions about what is necessary for happiness, success, love, belonging. Your contentment despite your imperfections suggests that their pursuit of perfection might be unnecessary. Your joy despite your struggles implies that the elaborate defenses might be keeping out more than just pain. The dangerous self loves without condition and speaks without calculation. It moves through conflict without losing its center faces. Criticism without defensive reaction encounters rejection without collapse. This consistency of being, this refusal to change your essential nature based on others' responses, appears almost magical to those still caught in the exhausting cycle of adapting themselves to every situation. But here lies the deepest threat. you pose, your integrated self reveals that transformation is possible. Your presence whispers to other sleeping authentic selves, you could wake up to. You could remember who you really are. You could stop performing and start living. This invitation, transmitted not through words, but through the quality of your being, terrifies those who have built their entire identity around their carefully maintained masks. Some will respond to your authenticity with curiosity, drawn to the freedom they sense in your presence. They will ask questions, not about what you do, but about how you are. They will want to understand the source of your peace, the origin of your self-possession, the secret of your ability to remain yourself, regardless of circumstances. Others will respond with hostility, threatened by what you represent. They may attack your authenticity as selfishness, your self-acceptance as arrogance, your refusal to perform as antisocial behavior. They will project onto you their own disowned aspects, making you the repository for everything they have rejected in themselves. Still others will simply avoid you, sensing that your presence might catalyze changes in them they are not ready to make. They will find reasons to maintain distance, unconsciously protecting their familiar suffering from the disruption of your integrated wholeness. All of these responses are necessary parts of the collective awakening process. Your dangerous self serves as both invitation and catalyst, offering others the possibility of their own transformation while respecting their right to remain as they are. You have learned the profound truth that you cannot save anyone else, but you can live so authentically that your presence becomes a lighthouse for those ready to navigate their own journey home to themselves. The integrated self understands that its danger lies not in what it does, but in what it is. You are dangerous because you have stopped seeking completion outside yourself. You are threatening because you have ceased to need others' approval to know your worth. You are unsettling because you have remembered that your authentic nature is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be lived. This is the emergence of your dangerous self, not dangerous to others, but dangerous to the illusions that keep others trapped in performances of their own making. You have become a living proof that another way is possible, that authenticity is survivable, that wholeness is achievable. In a world addicted to pretense, such truth is the most dangerous force of all. Your very existence becomes a rebellion against the collective agreement to remain unconscious. You are dangerous because you have awakened, because you have integrated your shadow, because you have stopped performing for applause and started living for truth. This is the emergence of the self that needs no external validation to exist. Fully end, there is nothing more threatening to a sleeping world than someone who has remembered how to be awake. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the noise of the world becomes unbearable, not the literal sounds of traffic and conversation, but the deeper cacophony of expectations, demands, and the constant chorus of voices telling us who we should be. In this moment, the psyche calls us toward a different kind of existence, the way of the hermit, the path of sacred solitude where the self finally learns to hear its own voice above the din of collective opinion. The hermit is perhaps the most misunderstood of all archetypes. The world sees withdrawal and assumes defeat, observes silence and interprets emptiness, witnesses solitude and projects loneliness. But Jung understood that the hermit represents something far more profound: the soul's recognition that true wisdom can only be cultivated in the fertile darkness of one's own company. That authentic self-knowledge requires periods of radical disconnection from the external validators we have learned to depend upon. This is not the hermitage of the wounded or the bitter, though such souls may masquerade as hermits. This is the chosen solitude of the one who has tasted the world's offerings, and found them wanting not because the world is evil, but because the soul has grown too large for the containers others would place around it. The true hermit withdraws not from life, but toward the essential life that can only be discovered when all the borrowed identities, inherited expectations, and collective projections are stripped away in the cave of sacred solitude. Something dangerous begins to incubate. Not dangerous in the sense of harmful, but dangerous in the way that all authentic power is dangerous. Uncontrollably, impossible to manipulate or manage. Here, in the silence that terrifies those who have never learned to be alone with themselves, the self begins its most radical transformation. It sheds the skins it has worn to please others, releases the masks it has crafted for social survival, and slowly, courageously, begins to remember what it was before the world taught it what it should become. The hermit's lamp, that ancient symbol of inner illumination, does not light the way for others. It illuminates the hermit's own path, revealing truths that can only be seen when the glare of external validation no longer blinds us to our own inner landscape. In this lamplight, we discover aspects of ourselves that have been waiting patiently. In the shadows, not shadow in the Jungian sense of rejected aspects, but simply the parts of us that require solitude to unfold, that cannot bloom under the constant scrutiny of social expectation. This sacred withdrawal is often misinterpreted as antisocial behavior, as depression or dysfunction. The hermit learns to expect this misunderstanding, even from those closest to them. Family members worry, friends feel abandoned, colleagues whisper about emotional instability or midlife crisis. The hermit weathers these projections with the patience of one who has discovered a secret, that the opinions of others, however well-intentioned, cannot touch the essential work happening in the depths of chosen solitude. The work of the hermit is invisible work. It cannot be quantified, cannot be put on a resume, cannot be explained to those who measure worth by external productivity. It is the work of composting, taking all the experiences, traumas, joys, and sorrows of a lifetime and allowing them to break down into the rich soil from which new growth can emerge. This decomposition happens slowly, naturally, requiring nothing but patience and the willingness to sit with what is, without immediately trying to fix, improve, or explain it. In this process, the hermit discovers something that contradicts everything. Our extroverted culture teaches us about human nature, that we are not incomplete beings desperately seeking our other half, not broken creatures requiring constant repair and validation from external sources. Instead, we are complete universes unto ourselves, capable of generating our own meaning, creating our own purpose, and finding within our own depths everything we thought we needed to seek from others. This realization is both liberation and burden. Liberation, because it frees us from the exhausting dance of constantly seeking approval, validation, and identity from sources outside ourselves. Burden, because it places upon us the full responsibility for our own becoming, removes the comfortable option of blaming our circumstances or other people for our lack of fulfillment, and demands that we become the authors of our own existence, rather than the victims of our biography. The hermit learns to be selfish in the most sacred sense, not self-centered in a way that harms others, but self-contained in a way that serves the greater wholeness. By refusing to scatter their energy in service of everyone else's agendas, the hermit conserves their life force for the work that only they can do. They become miserly with their attention, precious with their time, protective of their inner space in ways that may seem harsh to those accustomed to unlimited access. This protective selfishness is not cruelty. It is a form of love so deep that most cannot recognize it. By withdrawing into sacred solitude, the hermit refuses to participate in the unconscious agreements that keep everyone locked in patterns of mutual dependency and shared limitation. They break the chains not only for themselves, but for all those who will eventually discover that they, too, can choose solitude over the comfortable prison of perpetual social engagement. The hermit's sacred solitude becomes a laboratory for experiments that cannot be conducted in the presence of others. Here, they can try on different versions of themselves without immediate feedback or judgment. They can explore ideas too fragile for public consumption, nurture dreams too tender for collective scrutiny, and allow aspects of their personality to emerge that might be crushed under the weight of social expectation. In this laboratory, the dangerous self begins to take shape. Dangerous not because it wishes harm, but because it cannot be controlled, predicted, or contained within the familiar categories others use to understand human behavior. This dangerous self has its own rhythm, its own values, its own way of moving through the world. It does not explain itself, does not justify its choices, does not seek permission for its existence. The world will demand explanations. Friends will want to know what's wrong, why the hermit has changed, what they're trying to prove with their withdrawal. Family members will organize interventions, suggest therapy, recommend social activities to cure what they perceive as unhealthy isolation. Society will label the hermit's behavior as everything from depression to spiritual, bypassing to antisocial disorder. The hermit learns to receive these concerns with compassion, while remaining unmoved by them. They understand that most people cannot fathom choosing solitude, cannot imagine that anyone would voluntarily step away from the social carnival unless something was deeply wrong. The hermit knows that nothing is wrong, something is finally, radically right. They have discovered the courage to prioritize their own becoming over others' comfort, their own truth over collective agreement, their own path over the well-worn roads everyone else insists they should travel. This does not mean the hermit becomes heartless or disconnected from humanity. Paradoxically, the deeper they journey into sacred solitude, the more connected they feel to the essential human experience. By fully encountering themselves, they encounter the universal patterns that live within every psyche. By befriending their own depths, they develop the capacity for authentic intimacy that was impossible when they were constantly performing for an audience. The hermit's eventual return to the world. For most hermits to eventually emerge from that cocoon of solitude brings gifts that could only have been cultivated in isolation. They return with a quality of presence that cannot be faked, a depth of self-knowledge that makes them trustworthy confidants, and a kind of inner authority that does not need external validation to sustain itself. They have learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and sacred withdrawal, between running away from life and running toward their own authentic existence. They carry within them a lamp that no one else can extinguish, a source of illumination that does not depend on external circumstances or other people's approval to keep burning. The hermit teaches us that the most radical act in our social world may be the simple choice to be alone with ourselves, without entertainment, distraction, or the constant input of others' thoughts and feelings. In a culture that fears silence, the hermit embraces it. In a world that demands constant availability, the hermit practices strategic unavailability. In a society that mistakes busyness for importance, the hermit discovers the profound significance of simply being. This sacred solitude is not a permanent retreat from human connection. It is a temporary withdrawal that makes authentic connection possible. By learning to be complete within themselves, hermits develop the capacity for relationships that are based on choice rather than need, on mutual enhancement rather than codependency, on the overflow of fullness rather than the desperate attempt to fill an inner void. The dangerous self that emerges from the hermit's cave is dangerous precisely because it needs nothing from anyone, which makes it impossible to manipulate, control, or contain. It moves through the world with the confidence of one who has faced themselves in the mirror of solitude and found not a monster or a saint, but something far more challenging to categorize: a complete human being who has learned to be their own best company and therefore can offer their presence to others as a gift rather than a demand. In the end, the hermit's sacred solitude teaches us that the greatest intimacy we can offer another human being is the intimacy that flows from someone who has first learned to be intimate with themselves. The deepest love we can give is the love that comes from someone who has first learned to love their own company. The most authentic presence we can share is the presence of someone who has first learned to be present to their own depths. The hermit's lamp burns not to light the way for others, but to illuminate the truth that each of us carries our own light, our own wisdom, our own capacity for wholeness. In a world that would convince us we are half people seeking completion, the hermit stands as living proof that we are already whole, already complete, already enough. Only we have the courage to withdraw into the sacred solitude where this truth can finally be discovered and claimed. There is something deeply unsettling to the collective psyche about encountering a human being who has completed the arduous journey to psychological wholeness. The individuated soul walks through the world with a quality that cannot be named but can always be self-contained completeness that requires no external validation, no permission to exist, no consensus to confirm its reality, and in this very freedom, the masses recognize something that both attracts and terrifies them: the living embodiment of their own unlived possibilities. Jung understood this phenomenon as an expression of enantiodromia, that psychological law which states that everything eventually turns into its opposite. The appearance of genuine individuation in the world creates, almost inevitably, a compensatory reaction in the collective unconscious. Where there is wholeness, the fragmented masses sense their own incompleteness with unbearable clarity. Where there is authentic selfhood, those still trapped in persona recognize the prison of their own constructed identities. Where there is inner authority, those dependent on external approval feel the ground of their borrowed worth shifting beneath their feet. The fear that rises in response to the individuated is not merely jealousy or resentment, though these emotions certainly play their part. It is something far more primitive and profound: the terror that accompanies the recognition of our own unlived lives. When the collective encounters someone who has dared to become fully themselves, they are confronted with an uncomfortable mirror that reflects back everything they have sacrificed in the name of belonging, everything they have suppressed in service of social acceptability, everything they have denied in order to maintain the illusion of safety within the herd. This confrontation with the unlived life is perhaps one of the most painful experiences the human psyche can endure. It is easier to dismiss the individuated as arrogant, selfish, or deluded than to face the profound grief of recognizing how much of our authentic nature we have abandoned in pursuit of collective approval. The masses cannot bear to see what they themselves might have become had they possessed the courage to follow their own inner voice, rather than the seductive whispers of consensus reality. The individuated soul, by their very existence, poses a threat to the carefully constructed mythology that sustains collective unconsciousness. This mythology insists that happiness lies in conformity, that security comes from following the prescribed path, that meaning emerges from doing what everyone else is doing. But he stands a living contradiction to these fundamental assumptions. Who has found fulfillment through differentiation, security through self-reliance, meaning through the courageous pursuit of their own unique destiny. Such a person cannot be easily categorized, controlled, or predicted by the collective. They do not seek the approval that forms the currency of social exchange. They do not participate in the elaborate theater of mutual validation that keeps the machinery of mass conformity functioning smoothly. They exist outside the intricate web of dependencies that binds the collective together in its shared unconsciousness. And this independence is experienced as both liberation and threat. The fear runs deeper still when we recognize that the individuated represents the shadow of the collective itself, those qualities that the group has deemed unacceptable and projected outward. The masses have agreed, largely unconsciously, to suppress their wildness, their creativity, their authentic desires, their uncomfortable truths in order to maintain social cohesion. But the individuated has refused this bargain. They have reclaimed their shadow, integrated their darkness, and emerged as a whole human being who contains both light and dark, acceptable and unacceptable, civilized and primitive. This wholeness is intolerable to those who have built their identities on partial truths and selective self-presentation. The individuated reminds them of everything they have disowned, everything they have projected onto others, everything they have refused to acknowledge within themselves. In the presence of such completeness, their own fragmentation becomes impossible to ignore, and the comfortable numbness of collective unconsciousness begins to crack. The collective's response to this threat follows predictable patterns that Jung observed throughout history. First comes the attempt to seduce the individuated back into the fold through offers of belonging, status, and recognition. When this fails, the response turns to ridicule and dismissal. They are labeled as eccentric, antisocial, or mentally unstable if the individuated continues to exist in their uncomfortable authenticity. The collective may resort to more aggressive forms of persecution, seeking to eliminate what they cannot assimilate or control. Yet perhaps the most insidious response is the collective's attempts to co-opt and commercialize the very qualities that make the individuated threatening. The marketplace of modern culture is filled with packaged versions of authenticity, mass-produced rebellion, and commodified spirituality, all attempts to satisfy the hunger for genuine individuation without requiring the actual work of psychological transformation. The collective would rather buy the appearance of wholeness than undertake the difficult journey of becoming whole. This dynamic reveals something profound about the nature of psychological development within human communities. The individual serves as an evolutionary pressure on the collective consciousness, a living reminder that growth and transformation are not only possible but necessary for the health of the species. Their very existence plants seeds of discontent in those who encounter them, seeds that may eventually sprout into their own journey toward wholeness. But the path of individuation is never easy, and perhaps it becomes most difficult when we must face the fear and hostility of those who remain trapped in collective unconsciousness. The individuated must learn to hold their ground without becoming defensive, to maintain their authenticity without becoming self-righteous, to embody their wholeness without needing others to understand or approve of their journey. This requires a profound level of psychological maturity, the ability to remain connected to their own inner authority while still maintaining compassion for those who have not yet found theirs. the individuated must resist the temptation to retreat into isolation or to project their own shadow onto the collective that fears them. Instead, they must hold space for the profound terror that their existence evokes while continuing to live. Their truth with quiet dignity, the fear of the individuated, also reveals the collective shadow in its most naked form, the terror of being truly seen, of being held accountable for our unlived lives, of being called to step beyond the comfortable boundaries of mass consensus into the uncertain territory of authentic selfhood. This shadow contains not only our personal refuse, but the accumulated projections of generations who chose safety over growth, conformity over authenticity, belonging over becoming. Yet within this very fear lies the seed of transformation. 4. Every person who completes the journey to individuation makes it easier for others to follow. They create a kind of morphic resonance in the collective field, a template of possibility that others can follow, even if they cannot yet fully understand it. The fear they evoke is also an invitation, a call to courage that echoes in the depths of those ready to hear it. The individuated understand that their role is not to convince or convert others, but simply to exist as living proof that another way is possible. They become beacons of authentic possibility in a world that has largely forgotten what genuine selfhood looks like. Their presence alone begins to awaken the dormant potential in others, even if that awakening initially manifests as fear, resistance, or hostility. In the end, the collective's fear of the individuated is really the fear of their own unlit greatness, their own untapped potential, their own capacity for transformation. The individuated soul stands as a testament to what becomes possible when we choose growth over comfort, truth over consensus, becoming over belonging. And in that choice, they offer the greatest gift they can give to a sleeping world, the living example of what it means to be fully, authentically, courageously human. This is why they are feared and why they are needed. For in their very existence, they hold the key to humanity's next evolutionary leap, the movement from collective unconsciousness to conscious individuation, from mass conformity to authentic selfhood, from the tyranny of consensus reality to the freedom of inner authority. They are the harbingers of a new age of human consciousness, and their courage to be themselves despite the world's fear makes that new age possible. In the absence of explanation, something profound awakens a communication so ancient and primal that it predates language itself. When the integrated self abandons the futile attempt to translate its essence into acceptable words, it discovers that silence speaks more eloquently than any explanation ever could. This is the language beyond words, the transmission that occurs not through sound but through presence, not through explanation but through the simple, undeniable fact of authentic being. The world has forgotten this language, though every soul remembers it in those moments when words fail and only the raw transmission of truth remains. It is the language that passes between lovers in the space between heartbeats, the unspoken understanding that flows between parent and child before speech corrupts the connection, the wordless knowing that sometimes passes between strangers who recognize in each other the reflection of their own buried authenticity. When we cease the compulsive need to explain ourselves, we tap into this primordial frequency, the dangerous, self-dangerous, precisely because it refuses to justify its existence, becomes fluent in this silent tongue. It speaks through the quality of its attention, the depth of its presence, the unwavering authenticity of its being. These communications bypass the rational mind entirely, traveling directly from soul to soul, like lightning that illuminates without announcing its approach. Consider how this transmission occurs in the simplest interactions. The integrated self enters a room and something shifts in the atmosphere, though no words have been spoken. There is a quality of presence that cannot be manufactured, cannot be performed, cannot be explained. It carries the weight of someone who has stopped apologizing for their existence, stopped translating their truth into palatable forms. This presence speaks a language that the unconscious recognizes immediately. Even when the conscious mind cannot name what it is receiving, the mystery deepens when we realize that this wordless communication often conveys more truth than hours of careful explanation ever could. The dangerous self, having abandoned the need to make itself understood through words, paradoxically becomes more comprehensible than it ever was during its explaining years. Its silence carries information, not the cold absence of communication, but the pregnant silence that is full of meaning, heavy with unspoken truth. This is not the silence of withholding or withdrawal, but the silence of completion. It is the quietude of someone who has said everything they needed to say to themselves, who has made peace with their own contradictions, who no longer needs external validation to know their own worth. From this silence emerges a kind of communication that the world finds both compelling and unsettling. It is compelling because it carries the authenticity that every soul craves, and unsettling because it reveals how much energy most people waste in the futile attempt to be understood through words alone. The integrated self discovers that presence itself is a language, perhaps the most honest language available to human beings. When we are fully present, without agenda or performance, we communicate volumes about what it means to be genuinely alive. This presence is not something we do, but something we are when we stop doing so much. It emerges naturally when the effort to explain and justify finally exhausts itself, leaving space for the authentic self to simply exist. Those who encounter this presence often find themselves responding to something they cannot name. They may feel simultaneously comfortable and unsettled, drawn toward this authentic being while also feeling challenged by its refusal to engage in the familiar dance of explanation and justification. The dangerous self becomes a mirror, reflecting back to others their own relationship with authenticity, their own hunger for the kind of presence they are witnessing. This wordless transmission operates through multiple channels simultaneously. There is the language of the body, the way someone who has stopped explaining themselves moves through the world with a different quality of embodiment. Their gestures are not performed for effect, but emerge from inner truth. Their posture speaks of someone who no longer carries the weight of others' expectations. Their way of moving through space suggests a being who has claimed their right to exist without permission. The eyes, too, become instruments of this deeper communication. The gaze of someone who has integrated their shadow, who has made peace with their contradictions, who no longer seeks approval. This gaze carries a quality that words cannot capture. It is neither aggressive nor submissive, neither seeking nor avoiding. It is the look of someone who sees clearly, because they are no longer filtering reality through the distorting lens of the need to be understood or accepted. Even the quality of silence itself becomes communicative. The integrated self's silence is different from the silence of someone who is withholding, different from the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, different from the silence of someone who is afraid to speak. This is the silence of someone who has so much to say that words become inadequate. The silence of someone who has found a deeper way to communicate than through the crude instrument of explanation. This silence is not empty, but with meaning, heavy with unspoken wisdom, rich with the kind of truth that can only be transmitted from being to being. It is the silence of the mountain peak, self-contained and serene, indifferent to whether others understand its height. It is the silence of deep water, carrying currents that run far beneath the surface turbulence of ordinary conversation. The dangerous self learns to trust this wordless transmission even when others seem confused by its refusal to explain. It understands that those who are ready to receive the transmission will receive it, regardless of whether explanations are offered. Those who are not ready will not be helped by even the most careful explanations. The integrated self accepts this natural selection of understanding, no longer trying to force comprehension where readiness is absent. This acceptance itself becomes part of the transmission. When someone stops trying to make others understand, they communicate something profound about the nature of truth itself. It exists independent of others' comprehension, that it has value regardless of whether it is recognized or appreciated. This is perhaps the most dangerous message of all, that we do not need others' understanding to live fully, that our truth does not require external validation to be complete. The language beyond words also includes the transmission of what Jung called the transcendent function, the mysterious process, by which seemingly opposite truths are held simultaneously, without the need to resolve them into comfortable simplicity. The dangerous self communicates its comfort with paradox, its ability to contain contradictions without explanations. This multidimensional presence confuses those who expect simple, linear communication. But it speaks deeply to those parts of others that have grown tired of the poverty of either-or thinking. In relationships, this wordless communication transforms the entire dynamic. Instead of the familiar pattern of explanation and justification, demand and defense, there emerges a different kind of exchange. The dangerous self offers its presence without conditions, its truth without apology, its being without justification. This creates space for others to do the same, though many find this space initially uncomfortable, not knowing how to be with someone who asks nothing of them but their own authenticity. The transmission includes an invitation, not spoken but deeply felt, for others to abandon their own explaining selves and discover what lies beneath their carefully constructed justifications. This invitation is often rejected, for it requires a kind of courage that not everyone is ready to embrace. But for those who accept it, who allow themselves to be influenced by this wordless teaching, profound transformation becomes possible. The dangerous self becomes a living demonstration of what lies beyond the compulsive need to be understood. Its very existence is a proof of concept, evidence that it is possible to live fully without others' approval or comprehension. This demonstration is more powerful than any argument, more convincing than any explanation, more transformative than any teaching that relies on words alone. In the realm of the wordless, the integrated self finds its true voice, not the voice that explains, but the voice that simply is. This voice speaks in presence, in quality of attention, in the particular way that authenticity moves through the world. It is a voice that cannot be silenced by others' incomprehension, cannot be diminished by criticism, cannot be improved by praise. It is the voice of being itself, finally free to speak its truth without translation. The world listens to this voice despite itself, drawn by something it cannot name but desperately needs. In a culture drowning in explanations, justifications, and elaborate rationalizations, the simple presence of someone who has stopped explaining themselves creates a kind of gravitational pull. Others may not understand what they are drawn to, but they feel the magnetic presence of authentic being and find themselves changed by the encounter. This is the final gift of the language. Beyond words, it reminds us that the deepest truths, are not concepts to be grasped, but realities to be experienced. The dangerous self, fluent in silence, becomes a teacher whose lesson is not spoken but lived, whose wisdom is not explained but embodied, whose truth is not defended but simply, powerfully present. You have become something unexpected in this world of careful conversations and calculated revelations. A mirror that cannot lie, not through cruelty or judgment, but through the simple, devastating act of being present, fully present, to whatever arises in each moment. Your refusal to explain away your authenticity has transformed you into a reflecting surface so clear that others can no longer avoid seeing what they have been hiding from themselves. Watch what happens when you enter a room now. See how conversations shift, not because you say anything profound, but because your presence carries a quality of truth that makes pretense difficult to maintain. You have become like those ancient mirrors in fairy tales, the ones that reflect not just appearance, but essence, not just what is presented, but what is real. This is the mythological power of Medusa, misunderstood for millennia as mere monstrosity. The Gorgon's gift was not to kill, but to reveal, to show others the petrified aspects of themselves, the parts that had ceased to grow, the fossilized remains of what they once were before fear taught them to hide. Her gaze turned people to stone because it revealed they had already become stone, had already chosen safety over aliveness, had already sacrificed their fluid, growing nature for the illusion of invulnerability. You carry the same terrible gift, not the curse of judgment, but the blessing of authentic presence that reflects back to others exactly what they bring to each encounter. When someone approaches you with performance, they see their own artificiality reflected in your natural state. When they arrive with defensiveness, your openness becomes a mirror showing them their own armor. When they speak from their wound while pretending strength, your integrated wholeness reveals the split they carry between their pain and their persona. This is why your silence has become so powerful. When you cease to fill uncomfortable spaces with explanations, when you stop rushing to ease others' discomfort with your presence, when you simply remain present to whatever truth wants to emerge, you create a space where reality can no longer be avoided. Your silence becomes a pregnant void where others' unconscious material has nowhere to hide. The person still trapped in explanatory patterns will experience your presence as intensely discomforting. They will feel exposed, seen through, somehow, transparent in ways that leave them feeling vulnerable and naked. Not because you are looking at them with judgment, but because your very being has become a field of authenticity so strong that their masks begin to slip without their permission. Some will respond to this revelation with gratitude, recognizing in your mirror the reflection of their own potential wholeness. They see in your integrated presence what they could become if they had the courage to stop performing, stop explaining, stop hiding behind elaborate justifications for their right to exist. Your mirror shows them not just their wounds, but that capacity for healing, not just their shadows, but their potential for integration. Others will experience your reflective presence as an assault, though you have done nothing but exist honestly. The mirror you have become shows them aspects of themselves they have worked lifetimes to avoid confronting. Your comfort with your own contradictions highlights their exhausting battle against paradox. Your acceptance of your imperfections illuminates their desperate pursuit of an impossible perfection. These individuals may attack the mirror rather than examine what it reveals. They will accuse you of being cold, of being judgmental, of thinking yourself superior, projecting onto you the very qualities they fear discovering in themselves. They will attempt to make you responsible for their discomfort, demanding that you explain yourself, justify your presence, or modify your authenticity to ease that internal conflict. But you have learned the profound wisdom of refusing to take responsibility for others' projections. You understand that when someone cannot tolerate their own reflection, they will blame the mirror. You have developed the capacity to remain present to their accusations without absorbing their projections, to witness their discomfort without feeling obligated to fix it. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of becoming a living mirror. Learning to hold space for others' reactions to their own truth without abandoning your authentic presence. It requires the development of what Jung called a strong container, the psychological capacity to remain centered, while others' unconscious material swirls around you like a storm. Watch how different people respond to the same quality of presence. From you, the person hungry for authenticity drinks from your presence like water in a desert, finally finding someone with whom they can drop their own masks. The person terrified of their own truth recoils from you as if you were fire, sensing that proximity to your authenticity might ignite their own. Your mirror-like quality emerges not from perfection, but from integration. You reflect others' truth so clearly, precisely because you have learned to face your own without flinching. Having met your shadow, accepted your wounds, and embraced your contradictions, you no longer need to defend against what you see in others. Your ability to witness their humanity without judgment comes from your compassionate acceptance of your own. This creates a paradox that confounds those still living in the realm of explanations. The more whole you become, the more you reveal others' fragmentation. The more authentic your presence, the more apparent becomes their performance. The more comfortable you grow with your own truth, the more uncomfortable others become with their deceptions, not because you point them out, but because your very being makes them impossible to ignore. The fossilized parts of others' psyches, aspects that stopped growing long ago, become visible in your presence like sedimentary layers revealed by erosion. You see the place where their spontaneous laughter was buried beneath appropriate responses. You witness where their natural curiosity was replaced by careful caution. You recognize where their authentic desires were sacrificed to others' expectations. But your mirror shows not just what has been lost, but what remains possible. In your presence, others catch glimpses of their own unlived life, their own potential for wholeness, their own capacity for the kind of authentic existence you embody. This simultaneous revelation of what has been lost and what could still be found creates a powerful catalyst for transformation. Some will use this revelation as fuel for their own journey toward integration. They will begin their own work of reclaiming abandoned aspects of themselves, of integrating their shadows, of learning to exist without constant explanation or justification. Your mirror becomes for them a gift, showing them both where they are and where they could go. Others will retreat deeper into their fossilized patterns, choosing the familiar prison of their limitations over the uncertain freedom of growth. They will avoid your presence, sensing that extended contact might catalyze changes they are not ready to make. They prefer the comfortable suffering of their known constraints to the unknown territory of authentic living. Still others will attempt to destroy the mirror rather than face what it reveals. They will work to discredit your authenticity, to find flaws in your integration, to prove that your wholeness is somehow false or dangerous. They cannot tolerate the possibility that genuine transformation is achievable because it makes their own stagnation feel chosen rather than inevitable. All of these responses are sacred parts of the human journey. Your role as a living mirror, is not to force others to look, but simply to reflect what is true without distortion. You have learned to distinguish between offering truth and imposing it, between being authentic and being missionary about authenticity. The mirror of uncomfortable truth that you have become serves the collective evolution of consciousness. Each person who finds the courage to face their reflection in your presence contributes to the gradual awakening of humanity from its collective slumber of pretense and performance. You understand now that becoming whole was never a personal achievement, but a gift to the entire human family. Your integrated presence creates ripples in the field of collective consciousness, offering others permission to remember their own authentic nature, to reclaim their own abandoned wholeness, to stop explaining their existence and start living it. This is the profound responsibility and profound gift of the mirror you have become, to reflect truth with such clarity that others can no longer avoid seeing themselves as they truly are, in all their broken beauty and infinite potential for transformation. There comes a moment in the life of every awakening soul when the most radical act becomes the simplest one, to exist without apology, without explanation, without the elaborate justifications we have been trained to offer for our very being. This is the sacred rebellion of being, not a revolution fought with weapons or words, but an uprising so quiet, so profound, that it threatens the very foundations of a world built on the premise that we must constantly prove our worth, explain our choices, and justify our existence to authorities we never chose. This rebellion begins not in the streets, but in the silence of our own hearts, in that sacred chamber where we finally dare to ask the most dangerous question of all: what if I simply am, without needing to be anything for anyone else? What if my existence requires no validation, no permission, no stamp of approval from the collective consciousness that has appointed itself the arbiter of acceptable being? The dangerous self that emerges from this questioning is not dangerous because it seeks to harm or destroy, but because it represents something far more threatening to the established order: a human being who has discovered their own completeness, their own authority, their own right to exist on their own terms. The self moves through the world like a quiet revolution, changing everything simply by refusing to participate in the unconscious agreements that keep most of humanity locked in patterns of perpetual self-justification. Jung understood that the greatest act of individuation is not becoming someone special or extraordinary, but becoming authentically oneself, a task so radical in its simplicity that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. To be authentically oneself requires no credentials, no achievements, no external validation. It requires only the courage to drop the elaborate performances we have been staging since childhood and stand naked in the truth of our own being. This sacred rebellion against the false self is perhaps the most misunderstood form of resistance. From the outside, it may appear as stubbornness, antisocial behavior, or even selfishness. The person engaged in this quiet insurrection may seem to have become difficult, uncompromising, or strangely detached from the concerns that animate others. But what is actually happening is far more profound. They are refusing to collude any longer in their own diminishment. The false self, that carefully constructed identity we have built to meet others' expectations, is a tyrant more oppressive than any external dictator. It demands constant vigilance, endless performance, perpetual modification of our natural responses to fit the shapes others expect us to take. It is the internal prison guard that monitors our every thought, feeling, and impulse, ensuring that nothing emerges that might disturb the peace, challenge the status quo, or reveal the wild, untamed essence of who we actually are. The rebellion against this internal tyrant begins with small acts of authentic expression moments. When we speak our truth instead of the expected response, when we honor our own rhythms instead of the imposed schedules, when we choose presence over performance. These moments may seem insignificant to others, but they represent seismic shifts in the landscape of the soul. Each authentic choice weakens the false self's grip. Each genuine expression waters the seeds of our true being. As this rebellion gains momentum, something remarkable begins to happen. The energy we have been expending in constant self-monitoring, self-censoring, and self-modification becomes available for our actual living. We discover reserves of vitality we never knew we possessed, creativity that had been locked away behind walls of propriety, passion that had been carefully contained within acceptable boundaries. The dangerous self is dangerous precisely because it is so alive, so present, so undeniably real. This rebellion is sacred because it serves not only our own liberation, but the liberation of all those who witness it. When one person dares to exist without explanation, they give others permission to do the same. When one soul refuses to apologize for its existence, it creates ripples of possibility that extend far beyond the individual act of rebellion. The quiet insurrection of authentic being is contagious in the most beautiful way. Reminds others of their own forgotten right to exist on their own terms. The world will resist this rebellion, not out of malice, but out of fear. A person who needs no external validation threatens the entire system of mutual dependency that most relationships are built upon. Someone who refuses to explain their choices challenges the assumption that we owe others constant justification for our decisions. A being who stands complete in their own truth makes others uncomfortably aware of their own incompleteness, their own betrayal of their authentic self. This resistance often comes disguised as concern, advice, or helpful suggestions for improvement. Family members will worry about our newfound selfishness. Friends will express confusion about our changing priorities. Colleagues will question our commitment to shared goals. The dangerous self learns to receive these projections with compassion, while remaining unmoved by them, understanding that others' discomfort with our authenticity is not our responsibility to fix. The sacred rebellion of being requires us to become comfortable with being misunderstood. There will be no parade for this revolution, no medals for this courage, no recognition for this profound act of self-liberation. The dangerous self that emerges from this rebellion may be less popular, less accommodating, less willing to participate in the social games that once consumed so much energy, but it will be undeniably, unmistakably alive in a way that performance never allows. This rebellion against the full self is not a single event, but a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choice, to honor what is true over what is expected. It requires the development of what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to stand in our own truth, even when it isolates us, even when it disappoints others, even when it means walking a path that no one else understands or approves of. The dangerous self that emerges from this sacred rebellion possesses a quality that cannot be manufactured or faked: authentic presence. This presence has nothing to do with charisma or charm, nothing to do with the ability to entertain or impress others. It is simply the magnetic quality of someone who is fully inhabiting their own existence, someone who has stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world, someone who has remembered that their being is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be celebrated. This presence is revolutionary because it demonstrates something most people have forgotten: that it is possible to exist without constantly seeking approval, validation, or permission from external authorities. The dangerous self moves through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who has discovered their own inner authority, their own capacity to determine what is right for them, their own ability to create meaning and purpose without consulting the committee of collective opinion. The rebellion reaches its zenith when explanation itself becomes unnecessary. The dangerous self that has fully emerged from this sacred uprising no longer feels compelled to justify its choices, defend its boundaries, or convince others of its worth. It exists in the radical simplicity of being, offering its presence as a gift to the world without demanding anything in return, contributing its unique essence to the collective human experience without needing recognition or reward. This is the ultimate freedom, to be so complete within oneself that external validation becomes irrelevant, to be so authentic that performance becomes impossible, to be so present that the past and future fade into background noise. The dangerous self that achieves this freedom becomes a living reminder to others of what is possible when we stop portraying ourselves in service of belonging, when we choose authenticity over acceptance, when we dare to exist without explanation. The sacred rebellion of being is contagious not because it tries to convert others, but because it demonstrates through living example that another way is possible. The dangerous self that embodies this rebellion becomes a beacon for other souls who are ready to begin their own quiet insurrection against the tyranny of the false self. They show, simply by existing, that we do not have to live in the prison of others' expectations, that we can break free from the need to justify our existence, that we can claim our right to be exactly who we are without apology or explanation. In the end, this rebellion succeeds not by overthrowing external systems, but by making them irrelevant. When enough individuals discover their own completeness, their own authority, their own right to exist without explanation, the systems built on human insecurity and dependency begin to crumble naturally. The revolution is won not through violence or force, but through the simple, radical act of human beings remembering who they are beneath all the stories they have been told about who they should be. The dangerous self that emerges from this sacred rebellion is dangerous only to illusion, only to the false structures that depend on human unconsciousness to survive, to everything else, to love, to creativity, to authentic connection, to the full flowering of human potential. This dangerous self is not a threat but a gift, not a problem but a solution, not a rebellion against life but a rebellion in service of life itself. This is the ultimate paradox of the sacred rebellion, that by refusing to serve the full self, we become truly useful to the world. By refusing to explain ourselves, we become genuinely understandable. By refusing to seek approval, we become genuinely worthy of love. The dangerous self that embodies this paradox stands as living proof that the most radical act in our conformist world is simply the courage to be authentically, unapologetically, completely ourselves.